I was 20 when I met my spouse. We were married 36 years at the time of the divorce. He told me about his belief that he was a woman in a man's body at 32 years. He was 58, I was 61. We were divorced in November of 2018. When he first told me, came in the house one day, sat down, no preamble, no preparation, no warning, no nothing, and said, I'm a woman in a man's body and I've decided I'm going to transition. His entitlement was breathtaking. He never acted more male than when he was declaring himself a woman. Everything had to be done on his terms. Everything was an ultimatum. Just in general, the sense was that he was to be accommodated and I was to do the accommodating. My response soon after that, in the next week or so, was to decide that I wanted to get a divorce. And that's what I told him. We had an understanding that we were going to get a divorce. But telling him that made no difference at all to him in terms of his wanting to talk this over with me. He said to me in this exasperated voice, he said, I don't know why you can't help me with this. Gender is what you do. Well, I was a former women's studies director. That's what that was from. At the time, I thought to myself, no, I don't do gender, I do women. But almost the second thing that he had to tell me was about his sexual desires, as if I was going to indulge them or participate in them. I don't think he expected me to tell him I wanted a divorce. I think he expected me to simply adjust. My head was spinning. I didn't know what to think. And plus, he wasn't always consistent about what he would say. I spent a great deal of time trying to figure out what this might mean. And one of the things I found was something that was written by a trans woman, which sort of said, look, it's like an addiction. They're going to chase the high. They're going to spend your money. This is not really a good idea to stay. And so, which sort of took me aback. And I also encountered in 2015, it was the summer of 2015, the feminist academic Eleanor Burkett published an opinion piece in the New York Times called What Makes a Woman? And in that piece, she said, trans rights activists who want to erase womanhood or who want to define it in terms of naturalized gender differences that feminists have long fought against are on a collision course with feminism. In the comments to that article, somebody mentioned Blanchard and Bailey and autogynephilia, and I had never heard of it. And so I looked it up. He has a little typology and he has these characteristics, and I'm reading them. I'm checking them off. Oh, he does this. Oh, this is right. Oh, this is what he said. I saw that and it's like a light bulb went on in my head. It was a great relief. I thought, oh, I know what he is. And at the same time, it was a disbelief because I thought, holy shit, is this my husband? I told him about it and sent him a link. And he was very defensive and he was very angry. He mounted this sort of passionate defense of not only of autogynephilia, but of his inner female personae. He had two of them. One, the sort of feminine and sexual Lena, and the other one, Gwen, whom he described as uncompromisingly lesbian with a strong moral core. And he also had, he said, a little girl in him whom he described as only a couple months old and precious to him. He said, if Lena wants to hide in shame, she can do that. But Gwen, whom you have not met, is stronger than that, stronger than he was, he said, and isn't going away. And then he said, he himself, in addition to Gwen, would fight to protect the little girl. Who is he? Is he like the Trinity, 3 in 1? But when you're first hit with this news, right, you're not really able to grasp certain things, like the fact that your spouse has known about this for a long time and you're playing catch up, which keeps you sort of on your back feet. According to my spouse, he had first asked himself the question, could I be transgendered, in 2012. So for 3 years, he had been exploring this possibility without telling me about it. All I had was this increasingly strange behavior to go by. Summer of 2012, so it's the summer in which he started questioning himself. He wrote me a letter and left it outside my study door for me to find, in which he was talking about all the ways in which, he loved my butchness, what he referred to as my butchness, when he was trying to position me in relation to his femininity, right? His notion that he was feminine. He said something about he had spent some time in the summer when he was by himself, hurting himself. I assume he was watching sadomasochistic pornography, or at least getting on websites. I know he also was watching pornography with trans women who had breasts and had retained their penises, because at one point he said he couldn't stop watching it. I never saw him watch it. I think he watched it late at night when I was in bed. And I don't know how long it had been going on. I imagine it had been going on partly for that whole 3 years. First thing he said was, 40 something years ago, I was molested. And then, like, not even a beat, he said, and I am a woman in a man's body and I'm going to transition. I found out a little bit about the incident that he was referring to, and I never have ever understood what the relationship between those two things in that conversation were. Like, why tell me that, totally drop it, and then go to, I'm a woman in a man's body? Now, I know from some gay men who lived for a long time in denial that when they come out to their wives, they will often say that they've been molested in order to elicit sympathy, so that rather than the wife feeling her own sense of whatever it is, she's already primed to be thinking about him and to have sympathy. Whether that was going on, I really have no idea. But that was it. He came in, he sat down, he delivered himself of those two statements. I was shocked because I honestly thought that he was going to tell me that he was having an affair with this student. It would have been way easier to handle because it would have been such a cliche. I think my disdain for that would have carried me over the pain of it. And I would have avoided all of the subsequent damage. He said, if we are to be intimate again, I want to be punished. I'm a masochist. That was the first thing. And then the second follow-up to that was, I want to play the part of a woman. I want to be penetrated. And I said to him at that point, look, I'm not the right person to talk to about this. Get a therapist. So he did. He found himself a transgender therapist. The therapist said, she's grieving. The assumption being that, the husband was turning into the wife. And so the existing wife needed to grieve the death of the husband. I mean, it was condescending as hell, basically. He came home from that therapy meeting and said, Troy says, you're grieving, and this kind of wondering, oh my God, I haven't been thinking about you. Initially, I told him flat out, I'm not interested in engaging in sadomasochistic behavior. I have come to believe that some of the things that he did ask me to do were right out of porn and could have been out of S&M or sissification porn. He had a habit of, when we were engaged in a sex session, he at some point would lie back on his back and he would pull up his knees and he would breathe out, I need you to fuck me, meaning use the dildo on him. You have to understand, he's a 6'4" man. He's 300 pounds. He's not feminine. He's wearing women's lingerie, which he would have to change several times in the course of a sex session, which is how I thought of them. I did not think of them as making love to my husband or lovemaking at all. I thought of them as this sort of sex sessions as if I were a prostitute. And I had to train myself, in fact, to part him out, to objectify him in the way that that happens, because I couldn't stand to take in the horror of the totality of what I was seeing. The intimacy of a physical relationship, the emotional intimacy was not there for me. He was happy to use a strap-on because he believed that this was an activity that lesbians engaged in. I was offended when he referred to the glands of his penis as a clitoris. I didn't want to be the handmaiden to his bringing his inner woman into being. So that became more and more a problem over time. And I think that's probably the reason I stopped having sex with him. One time we had a sex session in which he didn't wear women's clothes. It was probably the first time he had not worn women's lingerie while we were having sex in a long time. But he did do the number where he pulled up his knees and goes, "I need you to fuck me." And afterwards he said, "Was that hetero enough for you?" And I thought, what does he mean by hetero? What about the sex that we just had was hetero? And I think it meant because he didn't dress up. His version of being a woman was all fantasy and possibility. It was not reality. And the therapist wanted to push him toward reality because he said to the therapist, "I want to transition." So the therapist is like, "Okay, well, here are some things you can do. I run a support group for people who are transitioning. You can come to that. You need to, sort of get the clothes and wear them and experiment with walks and voice and all this other stuff, as if that's what makes the sex, right?" The more that the more my husband contemplated the reality, putting into practice this fantasy, the less it appealed to him. I come in the bedroom one day after he's come home from his therapy appointment. He's lying on the bed and he's clutching a pillow to his chest, and he looks at me and in this pitiful way, he says, "It's going to be so hard, transition. Won't you please lie down and comfort me?" Well, I did. Instead of saying, "That is not my job anymore, we're getting divorced," I did it. Direct appeal, I couldn't say no, or I didn't say no. And one thing led to another. At that point, there's fondness, there's a little kissing. That's the moment at which my resolve weakened and I began to reconsider. So after that, we had other conversations and we had sex, and I thought to myself, well, now that he's able to be his authentic self, maybe we can have a good partnership, because there had been problems in the past. He said, "I'm not going to do anything to feminize myself irreversibly. I reserve the right to change my mind at any time down the road, but for now, I don't want to do anything to feminize myself." Well, almost immediately, I discovered that he was buying himself, this is ridiculous, but he was buying himself chocolate soy milk because he had read about the feminizing effects of soy estrogens. And when I said to him, "I thought you were not going to do anything to feminize yourself in that way," he minimized it. "Oh, it's mostly a placebo." And that was just a really small boundary breaking. But the dressing thing was more difficult because he established the boundary. I will simply wear women's lingerie in the bedroom, and I will not dress outside of that. He did do it when I wasn't at home, but he didn't do it when I was there for a while. And then one morning, I'm sitting in my study, and he comes in, he's gotten up, and he's wearing a sort of a woman's lounge gown. And he kneels down in front of me and puts his hands on my arm and looks up and says in his soft voice, "Is this okay?" I was so taken aback, and I didn't quite know what he was asking. And I said, yeah, yes, it's okay. Well, then it went on every morning, every single morning, and he wouldn't talk about it. On the one hand, it's just clothes. Who gives a shit? But it's not just clothes, right? I would come downstairs in the morning and see him sitting on the couch wearing the woman's lounge gown, drinking his coffee, reading the paper. And it felt to me like he was having a tete-a-tete with another woman, which was, of course, the way it had begun to feel in bed. When he was touching himself, it was like he was touching another woman. It was like he brought another woman into the bed and said, I love her, you need to love her too. It really bothered me to see it. 18 months I lived in my husband's closet. I had not asked to be told about his transgenderism. And then when he decided that he wasn't going to transition after all, I was pulled into his closet and the door was shut and I was expected to stay there. And I stayed there for 18 months. I told nobody at work. No one in the town where I lived knew a thing. After I left the house and moved into my own apartment, I began to tell some of my friends at work. Well, either one of them or somebody they told reported me to the Title IX officer with the concern that I was planning to out my husband maliciously in order to wound him. Not that it would have made any difference to him at work. I mean, it's a university. It's like, how woke can you get? I was interviewed by the chair of my department, a woman that I had hired when I was chair. I was basically told I was not allowed to speak. I was not allowed to tell my story. I was not allowed to speak to anybody on campus about it. The university had thrown its institutional weight behind my silencing and to support my husband's desire to live a secret life, and a secret life in which he was creeping on his women colleagues. He's going to meetings in which they're talking about punishments in the case of accusations of rape. He's on the committee in which they're adjudicating these things. I know how he's creeping on them and what he's doing with this information, and nobody else knows. And the university has thrown its weight behind that. It was like a second betrayal. That's another thing that son of a bitch ruined for me. I can handle the marriage. I can handle the private stuff. Shit happens. But I had a public life. I had a career. I had a reputation. I was liked by my students and my colleagues and respected. And the last 3 years of my life on that campus were ruined. And I left in a way that absolutely negated everything good that came before it. So one of the things that worried me the most, what is this going to be like for our son? Taking our son into account apparently didn't even occur to him. He felt entitled to what he wanted, and anybody else's discomfort didn't even enter into the calculation. When my husband decided to stay in the closet, I was not that unhappy with it, partly because I wanted to spare my son the same kind of anguished questioning and decentering that I had gone through. So when we did get divorced, I wanted to tell our son. At that point, I was like, you know what? I need an honest relationship with my son. I don't want it based on secrets and lies. And my husband was infuriated and he browbeat me, and I allowed myself to be browbeaten into not saying why we were divorcing. I did not allow my husband's version of it, which was we grew apart. And I told my son, people don't get divorced after 35 years just because they're happier apart. People get divorced for other reasons, for more serious reasons. You don't put your retirement years and your financial future at risk for frivolous reasons. And he chose not to know. And I chose to honor that. I don't like it. I feel like I'm enabling a dishonest relationship that my husband has with his own son. As an escalation, there have been a series of epiphanies for me. And I had told my friend, and at that point I had contacted the Straight Spouse Network, which I have to say at that time, they had very little understanding of our experience as wives of trans declaring men. I was having dreams in which I was looking for exits out of buildings, So this was about a month after we had that argument over the morning dressing, in which he had said, I thought I could get you used to it. I didn't talk to you about it because I thought I could get you used to it. My friend, the friend that I had told, was going out of town, and she offered me the use of her house. I went into the doorway of our bedroom, just kind of on an angle. And I told him that my friend had offered me the use of her house and that I was going to go. He barely looked up from his book. He says, I think you do need some time, in this kind of snotty way that suggested I needed to get with the program, that there was nothing on his end that was a problem. It was all me. And then he said, while you're gone, I'll think about what I want from you. He didn't say, I'll think about what we can do. I'll think about whether we have a future. He said, I'll think about what I want from you. I refer to this as my Bessie Head moment, a character in a story by Bessie Head, who is a woman who is in prison for killing her husband, killed him because he was impregnating young girls and allowing male teachers to impregnate young girls. And the parents of one of these girls came to his house one day, and his wife answered the door, and the parents said, what are you going to do about this? The wife had known about this for years, and this was it for her. Like, the parents there at her door, and she said, leave it to me. I have seen enough. And she kills him. And in the prison, there's all these women who are there because they've killed their husbands. The main character of the story kills her husband and goes to this prison where she meets the woman who says, I have seen enough. And the entire force of the story is to say, what is criminalized? What counts as a crime? And who is punished? And who is left to clean up the mess? And in all these cases, a woman is abandoned. Her children are abandoned. Her husband cheats. He comes home. He demands sex. She cannot say no. And in every case, the only way the women can find recourse, they take the step that solves their problem and they kill their husband. They themselves are punished, which they should be. They've murdered. Every one of them accepts that they were willing to take that upon themselves. And this notion that you reach that moment where you go, I have seen enough. I know the person. I cannot take any more. I've been teaching the work of the Arabic women writers Alifa Rifat and Salwa Bakr, and all of their work is filled with women who, at great personal risk and cost, do what needs to be done for themselves and their families. I was teaching these stories to my students while at the same time continuing in a situation that I knew was wrong. And I felt like all of those fictional women and those writers had the courage to do the thing that they needed to do. And I was not. I, full of all of the advantages and privileges that none of these people had. I felt like every time I taught one of those stories, I felt like it was an accusation. So when I finally reached that point, that Bessie Head moment, I felt like I had regained a little self-respect. It's really hard because I think most people, when they're in it, can only hear what they can hear. Taking the benefit of somebody else's experience and advice is not an easy transfer. Get out now. Feminizing works on them like an addiction. They're like addicts in the grip of a high. They keep chasing the next high, and nothing outside of that life will matter to them. And that includes you. You may be of use to them, but you mean nothing to them. Having sex with them will damage your psyche. The sooner you leave, the sooner you can begin to heal. It's easy to talk yourself, to rationalize yourself into something that later you very much regret. Don't let them isolate you. If you're not willing to leave, at least tell someone. You need a friend, you need a family, you need a therapist, you need an outside perspective, and you need outside support. Well, the hypocrisy is what gets to me, right? Because on the left, it's axiomatic that the untold stories will be told. This particular untold story, no one wants to hear. My experience is valid. I know what I know. I've seen what I've seen. And you ought to listen to me.